Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. I'm Jeff Arbuckle, and this is Monster Mondays, presented to you by Film Seizure. You can catch new episodes of Film Seizure with myself and Jason Oliver on Wednesdays, but Mondays are for me to talk about monster movies. Well, what do you know? We got ourselves another Guillermo del Toro monster movie on our hands. Interestingly, I also feel like Pacific Rim checks a couple of boxes. First, Del Toro gets to tell a kaiju story. And second, it serves as a big old test for the production company Legendary Pictures to see if their Godzilla series will be successful. And we'll circle back around to Big G in a bit. So yeah, we're going to do another Del Toro movie. And you should also probably be aware by now that this isn't the last one by a long shot either. Pacific Rim has a bit of a long and winding road that it took before it made it to theaters in the summer of 2013. The story starts back in 2006 when Del Toro was reported to be directing a fantasy movie called Killing on Carnival Row. But this movie ultimately wouldn't see the light of day. The following year, the screenwriter for that Killing on Carnival Row project, Travis Beacham, came up with the idea of Pacific Rim. And he kind of came up with it in sort of the same way that Gareth Edwards came up with his monsters idea when he saw a fisherman struggling to bring in a big sea creature with his net. Beacham, on the other hand, was inspired when he was taking a long walk on the beach and imagining a giant robot and a giant monster duking it out. Now, meanwhile, Del Toro was then slated to direct an adaptation of Lovecraft's At the Mountains of Madness for Universal. And I do want to take a little bit of a step back here for a second and think about Guillermo del Toro making a Lovecraft horror movie. I don't think that there would be anyone better suited for that task than he, but I digress. That film was ultimately canceled by Universal over what they perceived to be Del Toro not compromising with them on a $150 million budget and an R rating. Del Toro was absolutely devastated. While working on the pre-production for At the Mountains of Madness, he was intrigued by Beacham's little script about giant monsters and giant robots and said that he would like to produce and co-write it with Beacham. When his dream Lovecraft project fell apart, he went all in on Pacific Rim and even decided to implement some things that he always wanted to see in the giant monster genre. But what's Pacific Rim all about? Well, the movie starts with a little bit of information. In 2013, a portal opened at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean called the Breach. It was soon discovered that it was extra-dimensional. And from the breach came a kaiju, a giant monster, that rampaged into San Francisco and killed tens of thousands of people. The monster was stopped and people basically went back to their normal lives. 6 months later, another attack occurred, then another, and so on. It was now determined that humans had to fight back for their own survival. Countries started working together, and former rivals basically became friends in the interest of the survival of the whole human species. Now, the Jaeger program was born from this, and a Jaeger was a giant mech suit that would be piloted into battle against the kaiju. In the early days, no one doubted the ability of the Jaeger to defend humanity, but the mental strain needed to pilot the suit was far too much for any one single person. Every pilot died in testing. It was then determined that every Jaeger needed 2 people to pilot the mech. They would be mentally bonded to the Jaeger and then to each other in what they would call drifting. The stronger the bond, the better the pilots. The stronger and more capable the Jaeger would be in order to defeat a kaiju. Raleigh Beckett, played by Charlie Hunnam, is one of the pilots of the Jaeger Gypsy Danger, and he was a co-pilot with his brother Yancey. While trying to defeat a kaiju, Yancey is killed, and Raleigh washes out of the Pan-Pacific Defense Corps. 5 years later, the Jaeger program is on the outs, and coastal walls are being built to protect humanity from the creatures. However, larger, more intelligent kaiju are coming through the breach all the time. Marshall Pentecost, which is played by the awesome Idris Elba, brings Wally back into the fold as to pilot a Jaeger once again. After returning to the final base that's left open for the Pan-Pacific Defense Corps in Hong Kong, Raleigh meets a cadet named Mako Mori. After getting to know her and training with her briefly, he realizes that he is drift compatible with her. That means that they're basically able to co-pilot a Jaeger together, specifically together. Initially, Pentecost is very against the idea, but eventually makes good on a promise he made to her as a little girl. While they share space in each other's head, it's learned that Mako was saved by Pentecost and adopted by him after a kaiju attack in Japan killed her family. It causes her to subconsciously nearly destroy the Hong Kong base. And at that point, it's realized that maybe they weren't ready to go back into action, and they're held back from active duty. Now, meanwhile, a pair of scientists, Gottlieb and Geisler, are trying to figure out a way to stop the waves of kaiju that are coming out of the breach. Gottlieb works on trying to find a way to close the breach, but Geisler's plan is much different. He studied the biology of the kaiju and believes that they are clones or something that's grown from the exact same DNA, even though they always appear as something different with each subsequent creature that comes out of the breach. Geisler builds a machine to drift with a barely alive kaiju brain and learns that humanity is being attacked in a systematic way, and it won't be long before the final wave and assault will be sent to basically exterminate and extinguish life on Earth. Therefore, the kaiju being able to basically take over the planet and make it their own. Pentecost warns him about doing this, but also wants him to be able to do it again and be able to obtain a brain from a local black market dealer. But in order to finally get all of the details of the plan so that they can use it against the kaiju so that they can close the breach. So Geisler is sent to Hong Kong to meet with Hannibal Chow, which is played by Ron Perlman. Now, Chow is a black marketeer who deals in kaiju pieces, basically. He sells crushed up bone for aphrodisiacs. He sells various things that can be used for drug purposes or for the betterment of somebody's life. But all of it is pretty illegal. Now, while Geisler's there dealing to get the kaiju brain, two huge Category 4 kaiju come out of the breach. Jaegers are sent out to engage the monsters to keep them from making landfall into Hong Kong, but they are really no match for these two kaiju. One of the kaiju reveals that it has a nifty trick of an EMP that knocks out basically everything that isn't analog, and that leaves only Gypsy Danger able to fight back. So this leads to one of the coolest damn things I've ever seen in a kaiju movie, Gypsy Danger using an oil tanker boat as a baseball bat to beat the crap out of one of the kaiju storming through Hong Kong. You see all sorts of cool stuff in giant monster movies. Normally you don't think about these gigantic creatures ultimately using something else that's gigantic in what looks like a baseball bat. It's just so cool. I remember seeing that in the theater and just, it was so fantastic. Now, the attack on the breach is going to go on as planned, but with only two Jaegers left, Gypsy Danger and Striker Eureka. Due to one of Striker's pilots being injured, Pentecost decides to pilot it, but he also understands that he may need to sacrifice himself to close the breach because he's sick from radiation poisoning he got from the early days of the Jaeger program and design. Basically, the design was there to be built quickly, but not to really have much shielding from the radiation since they were all originally nuclear. In Hong Kong, Geisler uses the brain of a newly born but yet deceased baby kaiju to drift with Gottlieb helping, and they discover the plan to close the breach will not work unless what passes through the breach can pass with kaiju DNA. So the two Jaegers have to deal with two Category 4 kaiju and the first ever Category 5 that emerges from the breach when they arrive to enact their plan. Pentecost detonates his Jaeger to kill the remaining kaiju, and Gypsy Danger takes a kaiju carcass into the breach and enters it. And inside the breach, they are able to set the nuclear reactor to blow and exit through escape pods back through the breach. And therefore it closes it, and seemingly the war against the kaiju has completed, and humanity will be safe again and be able to go on about their regular business, at least until a sequel is made. Now, let's get to the three things that I like. And I should say these are probably three things that I actually love about Pacific Rim. First, the kaiju are very interesting in this movie. To start, they don't look like anything that we've seen before, and they don't really look like anything that's from this world. They are truly otherworldly and other dimensional. What's more, I really do like how they are categorized too. They are given categories like hurricanes and tornadoes. You know, the really tough stuff because, you know, they're forces of nature, and the kaiju are kind of, you know, treated that way as well. After Raleigh washes out, the Jaeger program is put to bed in favor of these huge coastal walls to protect the countries around the rim. However, the kaiju are also getting bigger and smarter, and so they are evolving and understanding human defenses better and better. In fact, one category 4 kaiju, the largest classification known at that time before the category 5 came out, was able to break through the coastal wall in Sydney, Australia in just under an hour. So they're tougher and they're more of a problem than ever before. Now, another thing I really like about the concepts at play is the whole idea that the Jaegers need a bonded pair of people to pilot them. It makes for a relatively interesting human story. In a lot of giant monster movies, the human story is purposely made kind of stock and generic in order to more easily crank out a movie that pays a little bit more attention to the monster battles. Here, Beecham and Del Toro are building a more scientific and grounded idea. Sure, the monsters are the mech, and the mechs are fantastical, but we have soldiers, we have government, we have civilians, and we have scientists affected, and they all have a story. The whole idea is to close the breach, but how do you do such a thing? It's an interdimensional hole in the world. What's on the other side? How do you close it? It doesn't really matter. It just has to be done. However, it isn't done in some ham-fisted militaristic way, really, either. There is some kind of sense of science at play in this story. I mean, and yes, there is a military outfit battling the creatures to try to close the hole, but the way a Jaeger works, it requires emotion and a little bit more tenderness for the story to work, and it really takes a lot more interpersonal relationship as well. Now, my third thing is a smaller thing, but it is a wonderful little detail that just makes the whole picture complete. If you read through the list of Jaegers, Gypsy Danger, Crimson Typhoon, Cherno Alpha, Striker Eureka, Coyote Tango, they all have very unique names, like fighter jets or airplanes that have call names, and it's just a really cool combination of words and names that give it a much more realistic feel. Also, Gypsy Danger just sounds like a cool-ass name. And Striker Eureka? Yeah, I want to say that I'm the pilot of something called Striker Eureka. Now, before I close out this episode, I did want to circle back around to Godzilla. As I mentioned, this in some ways you could kind of look at Pacific Rim as being this kind of test movie to see how well Legendary Pictures' Godzilla series, or Monsterverse as they eventually called it, would succeed. And it's really kind of interesting because at the time the Pacific Rim came out, of course the first thing the giant monster movie fans thought of was Godzilla. And we were just about to find out that we were going to be getting a Godzilla movie in less than a year. And we had just found that out, or we were about to find out. And so we were curious about how this would ultimately work. How would giant monsters work in a real world scenario, or in a more modern day scenario? Especially since sometimes giant monsters can have a little bit of a stigma with them as far as what some moviegoers will be reasonably expected to believe. And it turned out that while Pacific Rim didn't do absolute gangbusters here in the United States. It made a ton of money overseas, particularly in Asia. So it was a pretty good indicator to Legendary and the distributor Warner Brothers, who not only distributed Pacific Rim but also the MonsterVerse movies, the new Godzilla series. It was a pretty good indication to them that it was going to be successful and that they could get excited about the new Godzilla series. And not only that, but people who were giant monster fans, who were into this kind of genre or subgenre already, we reacted very positively to Pacific Rim. And I think that it was very clear that this was going to be the start of the ability to bring in kaiju back into American theaters and really just kind of bring it back to the world. And what's interesting is that, of course, the first thing a lot of us thought as giant monster fans was, oh my God, is Pacific Rim part of the Godzilla universe? Will we see Jaeger going to battle against King Kong or against Godzilla, or is this a backdoor way to create Mecha Godzilla or something like that? So it was just a really exciting time, and it was a really exciting thing to know that this was a little bit of a preview of what we would ultimately see, specifically with things like the Godzilla movie, even to a certain extent, the King of the Monsters that came out last year, but also to a certain extent how we could build kind of an interesting little combination of stories where you have a human element and you have a monster element, like with Kong Skull Island. So it was just a really great way to really kind of, it was the perfect appetizer for what would eventually come with the new Godzilla movies. All right, so that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. Until next week, I'll see you later, and don't forget to check out new episodes of Film Seizure every Wednesday and a new installment of Monster Mondays each Monday on filmseizure.com, as well as places where fine podcasts are found, like SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, and Spotify. You can also check out new posts at my website, bmovieenema.com, each and every Friday.